Hello, hello! Welcome back to Brenda's Books. Thank you so much for coming back to listen to more of Blemished Beauty. If you would like to follow Brenda's Books online, I am on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. And today we are on Chapter 17. Here we go. Chapter 17, Secrets. At the hotel's front desk, Tom paid for 2 adjoining rooms. Daphne moaned to herself as she realized she had lost track of all the things she owed Tom. She would definitely have to put this on the list. As they were walking to the nearest elevator, Daphne realized something else and gasped with alarm. What is it?" Tom cried, his eyes fluttering over her with worry. "Drat, you've probably been moving too much." "You paid my hospital bill," Daphne accused in a fierce whisper. "Of course I did. I'm the one who broke you. Are you sure you're okay?" he asked, looking down at where Daphne still held her side. "Tom!" Daphne exclaimed as quietly as she could while they entered the elevator. "That was the one thing you didn't have to pay. They could have just sent me a bill. Me." "You don't have enough money for that bill," Tom assumed. "Of course I don't, but that's not the point." Tom chuckled as he punched a number 4 button on the wall and kept his eyes straight ahead as the doors to the elevator closed. "I told you from the very beginning, Tom, I would pay you back for everything when I could." Tom turned his head in her direction. "And I told you I wouldn't take a penny of it." "How much was the bill, Tom?" Tom shrugged, moving his eyes back to the door. "It's a secret." Daphne threw her head back and groaned, and then she suddenly gasped in pain. How was it possible every tiny movement she made hurt her ribs? Tom looked down at her sharply. "Don't be upset about this. You'll hurt yourself." Daphne attempted a deep breath and tried to calm down. He couldn't do this. It was too much. She wouldn't allow it. The elevator doors opened. Daphne turned to face Tom and gave him her best pouty face. Tom's lips twitched as he motioned with his head for her to exit. She stepped out of the elevator as Tom hefted one bag onto each shoulder and led her down the hall to room 413. He dropped the bags promptly onto the floor and slid his keycard in and out of the lock. He opened the door without stepping inside. "This is your room," he told her. Tom leaned one shoulder against the wall. "I know it's getting late, but do you mind if I come in and talk to you for a minute?" he asked. "Yes, we do have something we need to discuss," Daphne said pointedly. "You're not paying me back, Daphne," Tom said seriously. "We don't need to discuss that." "Okay, we won't discuss it, but I will pay you back. I won't be able to live with myself knowing I owe you everything in the world." Tom didn't take his eyes off of her as he pushed away from the wall. He continued to stare at her a moment, until finally he reached to pick up her bag and carried it inside. Daphne followed closely behind. "Where do you want this?" he asked, turning around. "How about on that table over there?" Daphne suggested, pointing to the round wooden table in the corner of the room. "That way I won't have to bend much." "Then that's where it will go," he said, walking past the queen bed and placing her bag, his bag really, on the tabletop. He turned around and began to walk towards the door. "I'll be back in a minute," he promised. Tom almost had the door closed when he opened it again to peek his head inside. "Do you need any extra time alone before I come back?" he wondered. "Nope. Come on over whenever you want." Tom nodded and closed the door. Daphne climbed onto her bed and lay on her back with her hands behind her head. She began practicing her breathing as the doctor instructed. Tom wasn't gone 5 minutes before he was knocking at the door. "Is that you, Tom?" called Daphne. "Yeah, it's me," Tom said through the door. "Come on in." When Tom saw her on the bed breathing slowly, he immediately looked concerned. "Are you all right?" Daphne nodded. "Just practicing breathing," she told him. Tom came and sat on the bed next to her and rubbed her leg gently. "Does it hurt?" Daphne nodded again. "I think it's time to take my medicine." "I'll get it," Tom said in a rush as he stood. Daphne sat up and shifted so her legs were over the edge of the bed, not quite reaching the ground. She could hear Tom in the bathroom turning on the sink. A moment later he came back with her pill and a plastic cup of water. "Thanks," Daphne murmured, taking it from him and drinking every last drop. She set the cup on the nightstand next to the bed, and turned to see Tom staring at her again. Somehow this time it was different. He looked sad and full of yearning. "What does that look mean?" Daphne asked. Tom looked away toward the window and the blinds fluttering in tune with the heater unit. "Daphne, he said softly. Daphne patiently waited for him to finish, but he didn't. "What is it, Tom?" "You know what I want to ask," Tom said, turning to look at her again. Daphne's cheeks burned. She did know, but what could she say? She couldn't say yes or no. Neither one felt right. Tom seemed to grow more sad and anxious as the seconds ticked by. "Just tell me what you're thinking, Daphne." "I really don't know," Daphne confessed. She tried to breathe deeply, but the sudden intense feeling in the room was making it difficult. "Would it help if I told you about my plans?" Daphne cocked her head to the side. "I'm certainly curious now." Tom leaned into his comfortable pose with his elbows on his knees. "Well, my hunting contract ends in the spring, and I was planning on moving back to town afterward. I'll go back to college and get my business degree. Then I might be successful in starting my own carpentry shop." Tom smiled ever so slightly. "Really?" Daphne asked, intrigued by this new idea of his. "Absolutely. Maybe I can get a coaching job, too." Daphne smiled at the picture he described. Tom working in a shop and coaching a hockey team here and there. A sudden adrenaline rush coursed through her veins. She started breathing deeply, and it wasn't by choice this time. "You're going back to school and hockey. What's gotten into you, Tom Moulton?" Tom ducked his head a little. "You make me want to be a better person, Daphne." Daphne smiled brightly. "Thank you. That's probably the best compliment I've ever received." Tom started slowly running his fingers through Daphne's hair. "It's the truth," he said softly. "That's why I want to marry you. I need you, Daphne." He met her eyes with a gentle gaze. Daphne's heart began to pound all the more. That look grabbed her heart. She inhaled deeply to gather courage for her next question. "Tom, did you know that I've saved myself for marriage?" Tom smiled sweetly and brushed a hair from her face. "Of course I knew, Daphne. Why?" "Well, I was wondering if you had." Tom grabbed her other hand and squeezed them both tightly. "Yes, Daphne," he said seriously. "Tanya hated me for it, but yes, I have." "And there wasn't another girl either?" Daphne wondered. Tom shook his head more vigorously. Daphne sighed heavily with relief. "Anything else you're wondering about?" Tom asked her. Of course there was, but how could she talk about it? Tom stared at Daphne's face. Hope and desire ached within him so much it hurt. Why does she still look worried? Does she really not love me? What else could it be? Daphne's silence felt like somebody was slowly plunging a dagger into his heart. Ever since he had started to clean up his life, he had tried so hard to be a person his pa would be proud of. Obviously, it wasn't enough. It wasn't enough for Daphne. "Please tell me what you're thinking, Daphne," he pleaded. Daphne looked up at him for a brief moment, and then down at their hands again. The flash of grief he saw in them was agonizing. He dreaded the words he knew she was going to say. "I'm sorry, Tom. Can we just be friends?" Oh, he hated, even abhorred those last 5 words. They were the worst 5 words in the entire English language. Daphne started to rub her thumb over his. "Tom, I know you are so unselfish, and you always try to focus on what's important, and that's why you think we're a good match, but... Oh, no, please no. Don't tell me this is happening to me. Not again, not again. Please, not Daphne." He felt a tear fall onto his wrist, but it wasn't his. He put a finger under Daphne's chin and tried to coax her to look up at him. She wouldn't budge. Her shoulders were shaking just a little bit. He placed his palms on either side of her face and moved her head upward. Her beautiful green eyes were filled with tears. She wiped them away quickly before they could fall again. "Daphne, I can't bear this any longer. I love you," he whispered fiercely. Daphne laughed once without humor and wiped her eyes again. Then she grabbed his hands from her face and held on to them and put them into her lap. She was looking down again. "Tom, I know you think highly of me, and I appreciate it, I do. And you are more than wonderful, more than I could ever hope for. Wonderful like a friend? Oh, please, Daphne, spit it out. It's selfish to ask you this, I think, she claimed. There's something selfish in you? I would love to hear it. But you have to tell me before I go mad. Daphne sighed and looked up at him. Why did you want to marry Tanya, Tom? She asked. Totally caught off guard, Tom jerked his head back. He did not like where this was going. It was a stupid idea, Daphne. I don't know, but she certainly didn't have anything like the qualities you do. She was pretty, though, right? She assumed. Oh, no, not this again. Daphne, I hope you are not implying what I think you are. Tom, Daphne cried, suddenly upset. I know I'm everything on that responsible list of yours, but don't you think you should be attracted to me, too? Oh, blast it, Daphne, I am! Tom exclaimed, matching her tone. Of all the things in the world to worry about, that is not one of them. Did she really want him to explain all of his thoughts on the matter? How could she not sense how much he wanted her? Daphne was crying now. I know I'm insecure about it, like you said before, and I don't want you to have to deal with that either, she sobbed. Tom relaxed a bit and softened his tone. Daphne, look at me. She shook her head. Tom sighed. He put his hands on either side of her head. Daphne, please look at me, he implored. Daphne lifted her eyes to look at him. Do you think I am not insecure about anything? Good night. I'm insecure about nearly my entire adulthood. Daphne sniffed but said nothing. Tom continued to look right into her eyes. I don't care if you're not perfect in every single little way possible. I love you. You, Daphne. I love you just the way you are. Daphne's eyes began to fill with fresh tears. These were good tears. He liked those. And blast it all, you're beautiful, he said sternly. I'm attracted to you in every way, so you better stop this thinking of yours and get used to the idea. Daphne pursed her lips and wiped her tears again. I just want my rosacea to be gone permanently, not just come and go. I'm so tired of it. Tom rubbed her hand firmly. I bet you are. Just keep smiling. In the meantime, I love you anyway. Daphne looked at him with such wonder. I love you too, Tom. Tom's heart leaped and accelerated. Finally, she said it. His face split into a bright smile. Good, he said, leaning in to give her a kiss. She kissed him back, longer than he had expected before she broke away and rested her forehead against his. Will you marry me, Daphne? He breathed. You never did tell me what you said I needed to know. Tom groaned out loud. Well, so much for Daphne wanting him. They both lifted their heads, and Tom brushed through Daphne's hair with his fingers. A deep aching of dread seized him. But she did deserve to know. He had to do this. He knew it would hurt her, and that thought sliced his soul. I'm an alcoholic, Daphne, he murmured, taking a breath. Daphne's head shot up with a look of shock. What? Are you joking? Tom clenched his jaw together and shook his head. No joke. I've never seen you have a single drink, she pointed out. I haven't had a drink in 2 years. That still doesn't change the fact. Daphne was staring at him in horror. Is that why you quit school? That's why I was kicked out of school, he said simply. Daphne raised her eyebrows in dismay. She hesitated a moment and then asked, Did your dad? No, Tom cringed visibly. To have his pa mixed up with his behavior cut him to the very core. You cannot find better folks than my family. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to imply... I'm sorry, she mumbled, looking uncomfortable. Tom shook his head and got up to sit in a chair, so he was across from Daphne now. It's not your fault. It's my fault. My family now has to bear the shame of it forever. Tom rubbed his hand over his chin and had to look away from Daphne's penetrating stare. Why did you start? Daphne asked, almost in a whisper. Tom glanced up at her. She looked concerned. Tom inhaled deeply. I was coming home from class one day, upset about a grade I got on a paper I had written. I got an F. My professor in her comments basically told me I was pretty stupid. She did not. Not in those exact words, but she did tell me to go back to the 8th grade. Seriously? Asked Daphne, furrowing her brow. Tom nodded. Anyway, I was pretty miffed about it when I arrived at my hockey game. We were in the semifinals. I played horribly that day. My worst game ever by far. The opposing team scored 3 goals, all because of my defensive mistakes. We've all had bad games, Tom, Daphne said reassuringly. I know, but up to this point I had never been more humiliated in my life. My fans were booing me as I skated off the rink. Seriously? Daphne asked again with the same puzzled expression. Yes, and my coach was so furious he ripped me a new one in front of everybody. And I cried, Tom spit out. He gestured with stiff, straight arms out in front of him as he continued. They put a picture in the paper of me crying. Tom put his head into his hands and moaned loudly. It was so beyond anything I'd ever experienced. He lifted his head to look at Daphne again, whose face was solemn. And to top it off, Tom continued in the same harried tone, when I came home to my dorm room, I found my roommate making out with my girlfriend on the couch. She broke up with me. Daphne cringed. Sounds like a horrible day. Yeah, Tom said with sharp breathlessness. So anyway, I didn't want to go back to school, I didn't want to go back to hockey, and I didn't want to go back to my dorm. I went anywhere but those 3 places. Unfortunately, it was usually a place that involved booze. Tom rubbed the back of his neck. Of course, once I started, I couldn't stop. At first, I didn't care because I liked not feeling anything. But once my professors dropped me from their classes, and my scholarship funds also dropped, then I cared. Daphne rubbed 2 firm palms on either side of her head and blew out a gush of air. This is a lot to take in. Where did you go? Back home? Daphne managed to say calmly. Tom shook his head. I wish I had, but I was too proud, too ashamed. I moved in with a bunch of losers I met at a bar. That was my worst mistake. They were drunks too, Daphne assumed. Tom nodded. Every one of them. They ruined me. Daphne filled her cheeks up with air and blew it out slowly. How long did you stay with them? 2 years. 2 wasted years, Tom muttered, shaking his head. How did you get out and get better? Daphne wondered. Tom's already broken heart broke in half at her question. My pa dragged me out, he whispered. Literally. Daphne leaned forward and grabbed Tom's hand with hers, giving him the softest, kindest look he had ever seen. His heart beat rapidly as he courageously still hoped she would accept him. Daphne looked down at their hands and slowly rubbed hers on top of his. Then what? She whispered. Tom shrugged. Then my parents helped me through AA and suffered through all the small-town ridicule. Daphne looked up into Tom's eyes. What about Tanya? How does she fit into all of this? Tom laughed once without humor. She was the one who was making out with my roommate that day. Stunned, Daphne raised her eyebrows. Once I started getting better, she came back to me. I think it was mostly because she felt somewhat responsible for what I did. He shook his head. Ridiculous, of course. I really don't think she ever liked me all that much to begin with. I was just anxious to marry her because she was the first semi-good thing that happened to me after all that, and I wanted to hold on to it. Daphne nodded slowly, looking deep in thought. So then, why did you break off your engagement? She asked. Tom took a deep breath. She broke it off, he replied. Like I said, I don't think she ever really liked me. Daphne nodded again as a slow smile curved on her face. Well, I think you have won first place for the most interesting story I have heard all year, she said. Tom smiled sadly and gazed at Daphne as she picked up their hands and kissed his. You don't hate me? He asked. I couldn't. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Why are you apologizing to me? She asked. Because whomever I associate with now, no matter what the connection, I'll bring shame to. Nobody can blame me for being with someone who has already cleaned up his life, Daphne countered. So you forgive me? It wasn't very hard, Tom. Tom shook his head. "You're amazing, Daphne," he murmured, staring at her beautiful eyes. "Will you marry me?" Daphne held her breath as she stared at Tom. She didn't want to lose him, but could she really marry an alcoholic? She did love him, and he had changed, right? Tom was an exceptionally good person, no doubt. But what if he did relapse? Tom stood up abruptly and began pacing back and forth while rubbing his neck. "I have never wanted to know someone's thoughts more than I do right now." He stopped short and dropped his hand to his side. "Is it the alcoholic thing, Daphne?" he asked. "Are you ashamed to be with me because of that?" "Not ashamed, Tom, just worried," she confessed softly, avoiding his probing gaze. Tom let out an anxious sigh. "Worried that I will drink again?" Daphne nodded, still looking at the floor. Tom ran a frazzled hand quickly through his hair and then rushed to sit in front of her again. Daphne looked up at his face. His expression had never looked so stressed. "I swear to you, Daphne, I swear I will never have another drink again. I learned my lesson, I promise you." He spoke softly but severely. Daphne's heart wrenched inside her. She couldn't bear to see Tom like this. She grabbed his hand and put it in hers. "Tom," she said soothingly, running her hand over his. "I can't imagine how you're feeling right now, but marriage is a huge decision. I can't make a decision like that in an instant." Tom rubbed one palm over his forehead, which was beginning to perspire. "Okay, I can understand that. I think it would be best to put everything on hold." Tom looked at her sharply. "What does that mean? Put everything on hold?" "Let's pick things back up when we both get settled into real life." "In Broxville, you mean?" Tom asked. Daphne nodded. Tom cleared his throat. "Let me ask you something, Daphne. Are you saying you want to break up and then see if you want to date me when I get to Broxville? Or are you saying you'll wait for me to come and then we'll move things forward?" Tom appeared overly anxious and distraught. "Daphne, tell me if you will be dating other people in Broxville." Daphne hesitated. "You don't want me to?" "Of course I don't," he replied right away. "What do you want?" I don't know. If we aren't engaged, then..." Tom clenched his jaw and looked away. Daphne wasn't trying to upset him. She was just trying to do the smartest thing. Tom inhaled deeply. "Daphne, you just told me you loved me. Is that not true?" Daphne suddenly started to feel very nervous. "Of course I do, Tom. It would be impossible for me not to." Tom stared at her with a thoughtful gaze. "Then you must not love me like I love you." Daphne opened her mouth to speak, but Tom cut in. "Because if you did, you would say without hesitation you would wait for me, and I would be yours when I came back. Guaranteed." "No, it's not like I'm joining the military and will be gone for 4 years or something, Daphne. It'll only be for 4 months. "A lot can happen in 4 months, Tom," Daphne noted. Tom pursed his lips and hung his head low. "Then you don't love me the same way," he said, looking back up at her. His expression was a mixture of frustration and sadness. Daphne wanted to say something to make him feel better. After all, he deserved it. He had been more than sensitive to her tonight, and had given more to her than she could ever imagine. She also knew there was nothing to say. She knew she would feel guilty about hurting the man who had been so good to her. Even still, she couldn't say yes. It wasn't right. Not now. Tom stood up and turned his back on her and scratched both his hands through his hair. He took a deep breath and spoke to the window. "All right, well, maybe I'll see you around in the spring," he said. He turned around to face her. "I'll call for someone to come help you with your bag in the morning. Don't hurt yourself by trying to carry it on your own. I'll have a cab waiting to take you back to the university." "But just," Tom interrupted with his hand held out, "let me do that?" Daphne nodded. "Thank you, Tom. You're very generous." He abruptly leaned over to kiss her forehead. "Goodbye, Daphne," he whispered. "Goodbye," she replied, but he was already close to the door. She watched him step through the threshold before suddenly pivoting to face her. "Daphne?" "Yes?" "You really are beautiful," he murmured. Before Daphne could respond, he left the room, closing the door tightly behind him. Daphne lay back on the bed again, and she felt a sudden wave of sadness and emptiness wash through her. What did I just do? Tom was gone. She would miss him. She would miss him more than anything. And that concludes Chapter 17. I hope you join me next week for Chapter 18, Spit It Out, and Chapter 19, David. Both of these chapters take place 4 months later than the current time of the book, and it's very fun. If you want to find out more about Brenda's books, you can visit brendasbooks.net. Until next time, take care.